Well, we continue where we left B here, and that is in the summation. Speculation or absolute reflection is a critique of reflection, and particularly of philosophical reflection, insofar as its mirroring function permits the overcoming of the major antinomy of reflection, that between the empirical, formal or transcendental self-reflection of the subject of cognition, that is the thinking being, and the reflected object of this epistemological endeavor, what is thought. The determination of the object of cognition in terms of a self-alienation of the subject as the image of the subject thrown back by the reflecting mirror, or in Hegelian terms, as an itself that is in fact for oneself, is a movement of thought that permits at once the overcoming of the purely formal and constitutive function of self-consciousness in the process of knowledge, and the beyond of the object that for such a consciousness must always remain indecipherable. By establishing this speculative totality, philosophical thinking expounds and develops explicitly and exhaustively the logical presupposition of dividing philosophical reflection itself. Before we move on to further discussion of the philosophical achievements of this critique of reflexivity, it may be useful to assert that speculation is not a diffuse and occult enterprise. Speculation is rooted, as hermeneutic philosophers such as Gadamer and Ricoeur remind us, in language itself, or to be more precise, in the philosophical concept of language. At the very moment that language is understood as more than a pragmatic tool for representing what is, although this view does not escape the philosophical concept of language, it vouches for the possibility of articulating a relation to the whole of being, and of expressing it in language. Because language realizes meaning in speech or writing, because it makes communication and understanding possible. It must, in philosophical terms, be thought of as a totalizing medium. Undoubtedly Hegel, who brought the Greek philosophy of the Logos to its full completion, at first conceived of speculative meditation as an operation of thought alone. But since speculation is effective or real only where it finds its exposition in the speculative proposition, it cannot be altogether severed from the medium of language. Indeed, it presupposes the possibility of linguistic utterances and exposition. Let us look more closely at what Hegel understands by the speculative proposition which destroys the ordinary notion of the proposition. Although Hegel himself discusses the speculative proposition in the preface to Phenomenology and in the last pages of Science of Logic, as well in a number of passages from his encyclopedia, I shall consider only the discussion on the preface, since it's here that he is most explicit on this subject. Speaking of the speculative proposition, Hegel writes, "The general nature of the judgment or proposition, which involves the distinction of subject and predicate, is destroyed by the speculative proposition." And the proposition of identity, which the former contains the counterthrust against that subject-predicate relationship. The speculative proposition is thus said to alter radically the relation between subject and predicate in predicative sentences or empirical proposition. Well, what is empirical proposition? They are sentences with a predicative. Sentences that says something about something which upon we are looking. Easiest is to look at something that we measure, something that we weigh. And if we say something is 2 meters long, we have given by observation and being conscious as a thinking subject towards the object, looking at it through the mirror, through the lens, measuring it up and giving it a predicative of 2 meters. The object remains. That's a predicative relation. So one could say the speculative proposition is thus said to alter radically the relation between subject and predicate in predicative sentences or empirical proposition. I think that's cleared up now. The common structure of judgments or proposition consists from an Aristotelian or Cartesian perspective of the predication of a subject within the horizon of a determination of truth as certitude. But why should it be important to overturn the structure of predication, and what happens to that structure in speculative propositions? Ratiocinative thought, argues Hegel, is adequately expressed within the usual structures of the common proposition, because it conceives of the content of its thought in the same way as it conceives of the subject of the proposition. That is, as an underlying substance, a hypokeimenon, whose attributes are by definition clearly distinguishable. Yet the structure and the content of speculative thought as such is that it destroys the structure of the ordinary proposition. As we have seen, differences in the content of speculation, such as subject and object or subject and attributes being the same thing as predicates, are determined within the totality of which they are bipartite manifestation. The content of the speculative proposition is the identity of the self-determining concept and thought itself. Therefore, the common proposition with its possibility of absolutely isolating and separating subject and predicate, seems an inappropriate form of expression for speculative content. But what then are the ways in which speculative content destroys the traditional form of judgment? First, despite the fact that the speculative critique of the form of predicative propositions is a critique of Kant, Hegel's speculative reinterpretation of the structure of judgment is possibly only as a result of Kant's insight into the ternary structure of the proposition. The germ of speculation lies in this triplicity alone, Hegel writes in Faith and Knowledge. Indeed, at the beginning of paragraph 19 of the second deduction of Transcendental Logic in Critique of Pure Reason, Kant admits that he is not satisfied with the logician's definition of judgment as a representation of a relation between two concepts. He recognizes that for a judgment to be possible, a third element or medium must be added to the two relating concepts. For Kant, this medium is self-consciousness, and it ties the relationship between the two concepts to the originary synthetic unity of apperception. This third term, according to Kant, explains the synthetic character of proposition or judgment. Even if Hegel finds fault with this Kantian explanation of judgment, which, since the medium self-consciousness is not for Kant a concept, remains formally a binary synthesis of subject and predicate. Kant's hypothesis of a ternary structure of the proposition serves as the starting point for Hegel's development of the speculative proposition. Hegel develops the simple proposition of judgment into the syllogism. His speculative interpretation of judgment is, so to speak, quaternary interpretation of triplicity. Fine words. Quaternary because Hegel's replacing self-consciousness with the third concept does not do away with the self-consciousness, but reinstate it as a fourth position from which it grounds and animates the triplicity itself. It is only a more consistent development of Kant's own discovery. Yet, it is important to realize, as Werner Marx has argued, that despite the incongruity between the speculative content and the ordinary structure of the proposition, the form of the ordinary proposition is not overtly destroyed. At first, speculative thought is what simply projected into the traditional form of the proposition. What then does such an inner destruction of the traditional form of the proposition amount to? Question mark. Hegel's own example of such an inner destruction of the common figure of the proposition by a speculative content is the statement, God is being. In contrast to the conventional relation between subject and predicate in a proposition, being in the proposition God is being has acquired an essential substantiality. Something which destroys its character as a predicate, and in which the subject God becomes dissolved. According to this example, a speculative sentence is one which the predicate of the proposition is made a subject, the one looking into the mirror. The speculative content of the proposition, God is being, reads, being is God. Speculative thought does not proceed by affirming or denying, this is very important, predicates about the subject that would remain a stable and a solid base throughout the process of determination. Hegel remarks, here, thinking, instead of making progress in the transition from subject to predicate, in reality feels itself checked by the loss of the subject, and missing it is thrown back onto the thought of the subject, or, since the predicate itself has been expressed as a subject, as the being or essence, which exhausts the nature of the subject, thinking finds the subject immediately in the predicate now, having returned into itself in the predicate, instead of being in a position where it has freedom for argument. It is still absorbed in the content, or at least faced with the demand that it should be. In other words, the inner revolution of the proposition made possible by a speculative content is not limited to a simple reversal of the subject and the predicate. The counterthrust of which Hegel speaks makes the speculative proposition a proposition of identity. Hence, what is changed by the speculative content in the usual subject-predicate relation or proposition is not only the respective positions of the subject and the predicate, but the very status of the copula in the judgment. Copula is the it is or is. The is has radically changed meaning. It no longer secures the attribution of predicates to subject, of universes to the particular. Instead, it expresses an identity that is itself both passive and transitive. The copula of the proposition thus becomes the real subject of the speculative proposition. It expresses the absolute itself, and the absolute is the totality of the concept. The copula is really important, and let me just go through this and I will add a little thing here. So what we've gone through before is isolated reflection in A, and then we come to philosophical reflection, and then we have absolute reflection. I demonstrated this like that. This is the mirror image, and in isolated reflection you either take that side or that side. It's an either or relation. This is philosophical reflection, and here you take both sides, and you do that by making the dividing line sharper, because a little bit like you're taking negative space, that makes it possible to have an object. It goes for determination, definitiveness, and it's at the same time a nullification of the oppositions. Here one could say the opposition still works because you are only focusing on one. By taking in both, the opposition nullifies each other. That's the Vernichtung. Here we have absolute reflection. So A sees only one side, B conceives of both sides. We have a nullification, Vernichtung, and here we encompasses yet let difference be. So the copula is very important. We often ignore the copula. In grammar, it's seen as something completely unnecessary and doesn't do anything, and I think that's one of those false beliefs of our own language. Remember philoque. This is enclitic and the sun. This parted Christianity into two divisions that remain even to this day, because it takes over the philo, one could say. The philo can no longer be the philo because of the copula. And this is exactly what absolute reflection is about. I never really understood until this very moment why philoque is so important. And it will not make itself clear in the regular explanations. How often have I read about the split between Eastern and Western Christianity? I have never ever understood it, because the descriptions are not sufficient. And I was not sufficiently, I didn't understand sufficiently what is reflection. That was my problem as well. So it was on both parts. But thanks to Rodolphe Gachet, it becomes clear now, although his object, of course, was not to explain anything about the cataclysm in early Christianity. Something that happened frequently after that, and the reason being one side of the combatants did not understand what this actually makes. It changes everything, although copula is seen as something completely negligible, unimportant, of minimalistic affection on anything. In other words, the inner revolution of the preposition made possible by a speculative content is not limited to a simple reversal of subject and predicate. The counterthrust of which Hegel speaks makes the speculative proposition a proposition of identity. Hence, what is changed by the speculative content in the usual subject-predicate relation of proposition is not only the respective position of the subject and predicate, but the very status of the copula in the judgment. The is has radically changed meaning. It no longer secures the attribution of predicates to subject, of universals to particular, how well put. Instead, it expresses an identity that is itself both passive and transitive. Transitive meaning that it takes in something else. The copula of the proposition thus becomes the real subject of the speculative proposition. It expresses the absolute itself, the absolute that is the totality of the concept. In what ways, then, is the speculative proposition different from the empirical proposition? Well, although a speculative proposition resembles the empirical proposition in appearance, it is destructive of the binary and reflective form of the relation of the subject and the predicate. In a speculative proposition, the predicate is no longer class, a sensible generality, but a category, a universal determination. It is the very substance, the essence of the subject. The subject of the ordinary proposition becomes lost in the substantial essence of the predicate in the speculative proposition. With the identity of subject and predicate, an identity that makes the bonds of reflection disappear, mediation becomes the true subject of the proposition. Well, mediation is the copula we're referring to. Such mediation as a totalizing process of determination stands for absolute reflection. That is something to figure on. Within the speculative proposition, Hegel argues, the difficulties of reflection insofar as they pertain to the structure of judgment are overcome. While on the level of judgment, the speculative proposition represents the solution of the Kantian reflective difference between the empirical proposition as a formal relation of two concepts and self-consciousness as the judiciary medium of the synthetic function of judgment. In the speculative judgment, the solution is the result of the synthesizing function of the copula, of the dialectical self-reflection of mediation in which subject and predicate becomes identical. The solely inward destruction of the empirical proposition, however, is still insufficient. Hegel writes, the sublation of the form of the proposition must not happen only in an immediate manner, through the mere content of the proposition. On the contrary, this opposite movement must find explicit expression. It must not just be the inward inhibition mentioned above. This return of the notion into self must be set forth, dargestellt, This movement, which continues what formerly the proof was supposed to accomplish, is the dialectical movement of the proposition itself. This alone is the speculative in act, wirkliche. And only the expression of this movement is a speculative exposition, Darstellung. Since the predicate in a speculative proposition must exhibit its nature as subject, and since this can occur only dialectically through mediation, one proposition alone is incapable of explicitly expressing the speculative. This is why the true speculative the speculative in act, wirkliche, requires what Hegel calls speculative exposition. In speculative exposition, not only is the speculative content devoted to the immediate or inward destruction of the common form of the proposition. The speculative expresses itself in an effective manner as well. As Werner Marx has shown, absolute reflection achieves its essence only in such a speculative exposition of the speculative content. Within the presentation of the whole as truth, a singular proposition is something fixed and positively dead, and hence something wrong. The simple proposition can at best denote a fixed result. In the portrayal of the life of truth and the completing itself as a whole, the proposition in its particularity is sublated. The single proposition becomes a link in a chain of propositions. The single proposition becomes a link in a chain of propositions. The propositions are linked together as presupposing and as positing. Therein lies the sole possibility of showing how the totality of determinations is fused into true association. The speculative presentation must take command on an entire system of propositions. The passage from the structure of the single speculative proposition to the texture and totality of sentences marks the transition from speculation to dialectics. Dialectics is the thing of Hegel. While the young Hegel used speculation and dialectics synonymously, In his later works, he distinguishes between these concepts. The passage from the structure of a single speculative proposition to the texture and totality of sentences marks the transition from speculation to dialectics. While the young Hegel used well, I just mentioned that. Dialectics in the preface to Phenomenology signifies the mode of exposition of speculative content. Begins with dialectics. With dialectics, speculation turns from a purely inward revolution into an active demonstration of its contents. Yet, since the dialectical exposition of the speculative in a system of propositions empties this proposition of everything that is not the notion of concept, or everything that the notion does not comprehend, the passage to dialectics do not correspond to a simple exteriorization of speculation in the medium of language. Language is used in the dialectical exposition of speculative thought only to the extent that the proper meaning of the words is entirely superseded by categories, which themselves form a logical totality, and in which they appear only as moments of self-determining notion or concept. Although the dialectical mediation of the speculative takes place only in thought, its altered state, language, represents an essential moment in the completion of the totality of the concept. Language thus becomes the privileged meaning by which the concept can acquire the total transparency, the absolute intelligibility that characterizes it as the totality of the reflected moments of the process of its own becoming. And I think this is the reason why Derrida took Hegel as his pre-model, and why he used the Hegelian word destruction. This is what turned into deconstruction. What Derrida meant with Hegel is that language is the savior of the absolute, so to speak, in simplified terms. Only by language and opening up for language and its determinate factors can we encompass the absolute. Otherwise we'll be stranded either in isolated reflection or philosophical reflection. But language as a signifier makes yet another step possible, and in this step all the other steps comes together. And that is one of the reasons we usually shy away from language and expels it, because we think it doesn't fit into the system. We go directly from isolated reflection to absolute reflection. We forgot philosophical reflection. And in that process, we cannot reach the absolute reflection. We get stranded in an either or situation. Well, I think it's time to say thank you very much, and wish you a very pleasant afternoon or evening, whatever it is where you are. And also have to say, be patient. This is slowly opening up. I think great progress has been made in the last 2 lectures. Let's wait until the flowering of that. It will all open up like a fantastic oyster. Well, I wish you a pleasant night.